I'd like to welcome our third and final panel to the stage now. This panel will be on public interest journalism. The rise of misinformation, polarisation, and AI-generated fake content has increased the need for bold, nuanced journalism. Fearless reporting holds politicians accountable, exposes corrupt misconduct, and amplifies the voices of the powerless. Jim Middleton will be chairing this panel. Jim is a former journalist with 5 decades of experience, including 20 years as ABC's chief political correspondent in Canberra. Joining Jim on the panel will be Professor Peter Greste, Professor Wallace, and Delia Obst. Please join me in welcoming our third panel.
Good afternoon, and very good to see you all here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, past and present, and what a great panel that was just a moment ago. And I was reminded that when the Bring Them Home report came down in 1997, it was only then that I realised that I had still been living in Western Australia in the late 1960s when separating Indigenous children from their mothers and fathers was still official policy. It came as quite a shock to me to discover that, and it was a reminder, if we needed it, that the work that you're doing now is so very, very important indeed. Joining me on the panel to discuss public interest journalism and its relationship to what we've all been talking about today, transparency and accountability. Peter Greste, journalist, and now heads up the Alliance for Journalist Freedom and also remains a significant campaigner for improvements to the management of hostage diplomacy. And good luck with that, Peter. Delia Obst, who is the Manager of Government Relations for Australian Associated Press, which remains a very significant contributor to fact-based journalism in this country and fills a gap that otherwise we would miss very, very seriously. And Professor Wallace, journalist, author, and academic. Multi-skilling, Chris. Fantastic. Look, we've heard a lot today about the creeping cult of secrecy, or maybe galloping cult of secrecy, when it comes to the executive and the public service. So I thought it might be an idea to start by asking the panellists whether they thought we had the media that was up to addressing the cult of secrecy in the public interest, and if not, why not? Maybe you could start, Peter.
Thanks, Jim. Look, I think let's start with the basic principles. At the risk of patronising everyone, Democracy 101 says that we've got to have a free press. I mean, the reason we identify press freedom as a subset of freedom of speech isn't because we want to privilege a particular class of individuals. It's because we recognise the fundamental need for a source of information that is produced in line with a set of ethics and codes and professional standards that qualifies as journalism, that it sort of elevates that source of information above and beyond mere speech, and that we have a class of individuals who have the training, the experience and the resources to deliver that kind of information. We can't have proper public debate, we can't have proper policy making, we can't keep government honest and accountable without that kind of journalism. So the question is, have we got that? And for a whole host of reasons, some of which I think falls in the scope of what we're discussing today, some of which maybe not, but I don't think we've got it. One of our big issues at the Alliance for Journalist Freedom is something that was mentioned earlier today, and that's the lack of any constitutional statutory protection for press freedom. We are the only liberal democracy in the world that doesn't have press freedom written into its constitution. What we saw after 9/11 was what one Canadian researcher described as hyper-legislation. Currently, we've got almost 100 separate pieces of national security legislation that were passed in the wake of 9/11, more than any other country on earth. And what that's done is, without the restraint that a constitutional protection for press freedom provides, we've seen a lot of those laws eat away at the space that journalists are able to or need to operate in, whether it's protecting their own data from overbearing investigation, whether it is protecting their sources from prosecution, whether it is actually making the kind of journalistic investigations that in the past would have been seen as perfectly legitimate. So what we're proposing is a Media Freedom Act, something that would perform the same function as a constitutional amendment, but stops short of actually having to go through the kind of constitutional hurdles that stand in the way of that kind of progress. Obviously, we would love a constitutional reform that says that, or that puts in place a Media Freedom Act. We recognise that if we can't get First Nations Australians into our constitution, then we've got Buckley's chance of getting journalists who are some of the most despised people in the country in the constitution. But the fact is that we need that. We need that kind of legislative top cover. And we can do that through an act of parliament. I'm happy to explain how that works, but at least let's lay that on the table as the way forward to provide the kind of legislative framework that protects journalists, journalism, and their sources.
Look, we might come to the details of that a little bit later on, Peter, but Delia, to you, are our media up to it when we see the extent and reach of secrecy within our government and within our public service in particular, but also within the corporate world?
Yeah, I mean, one way to come at that, I think, and something that's been touched on earlier is the sort of constraints of resources is one way in which, I guess, the media at the moment is quite undermined. When it comes to, I guess, public interest journalism, there is a great value in public interest journalism, but there is a real lack of, willingness to fund it, to pay for it, to engage with it. So, the government, in a way, there is value when we're looking at the institution, Fourth Estate, the value of that. Let's invest in public interest journalism so that there is the resources to do that role properly. But I think because we're in this really challenging time for newsrooms and we're in this sort of state of, as individuals, not, being part of that new media environment and getting our news, our information from different sources, I think one thing that we can also consider, on the one hand, obviously, the government needs to be held to account, and then us as individuals, we have to value that public interest journalism, and we have to look at how it's resourced, and we have to engage with it. And so I think, obviously the sort of cult of secrecy that you mentioned, there are a lot of issues around FOI, and some departments we find are better than others. But when it comes to that day-to-day recording, which is one of the primary purposes of public interest journalism, we can talk about the challenges of accessing it, but one of the primary purposes is to have a public record, which is one of the things that AOP I think is really essential for. And that requires resources. And at the moment, resources are extremely constrained. So it's a big challenge, I think.
Yes, Chris?
Yes, totally second both of your contributions there. I think one of the problems, Jim, is we're all swimming in a pond that we don't understand we're swimming in. It's the securitisation moment that happened after S11. As Cabinet historian for the 2000 and 2001 Cabinet papers, I wrote about this for the National Archives. But that moment, S11, changed our world, and it profoundly transformed for the worse the parameters possible for public interest journalism. From that moment on, you could see the Howard government make every single policy in government seen through the prism of national security. So it's like the joke about the fish, you know, two fish are swimming in a pond and one fish says to the other fish, the water's cold today, and the other fish says, what's water? We do not realise how that securitisation moment culturally transformed the possible for journalists and therefore society. And until we can become aware of that very adverse shift, we can't undo it. Just, you know, compare and contrast when you and I started out in journalism, Jim, we could pick up the Commonwealth Government Directory. Every single SES officer would be in it, together with their direct phone line. I mean, I actually met my husband by picking up the Commonwealth Directory and ringing this stranger in DFAT to hit him up for some information. He didn't give me any, actually, but that's beside the point. Now, to even get a return call from a government minister's press secretary is a massive challenge. Government has become closed and inward-facing. Citizens sense this, and it's such a powerful driver for discontent. We can't understand why our own governments don't want to talk to us anymore. And of course, the primary people doing that talking are journalists working in the public interest. So just as we've kind of we're not aware of what happened in 2001, changing everything in a way that's been very bad for society in these senses, we're in the fighting the last war moment. We haven't woken up and won the war against that development. And as we look toward the horizon, we see the tsunami of AI and disinformation coming at us. It's just kind of mind-blowing.
Peter, I can see you're itching to come up with either an observation or a remedy. I hope it's the latter.
Well, no, I think it's more of an observation. It was just reflecting on what you were saying, Chris, that after the AFP raid, how many of you remember that in 2019, the Australian Federal Police raided the offices of both Annika Smethurst from News Corp and...
Her home, actually.
Her home, sorry, yes, it was her home, and started going through her underwear drawer. And then very next day, the officers of the ABC, and in both cases, they were looking for evidence of sources to two stories that relied on leaked classified information. Now, those leaks, there was never any evidence that those leaks actually compromised security, but they did raise stories that were absolutely in the public interest. And the New York Times took a look at Australia and our sort of culture of secrecy, and they said, and I still remember this headline to this day, they said, Australia may well be the world's most secretive democracy. And I think that is quite shocking for a country that likes to present itself as progressive, as open, as liberal.
In a way, is it that surprising? I think you can actually make an historical argument that we are ground zero for the contemporary disinformation effort. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but the 1975 election, where the Australian invented a reality in inverted commas, around the Whitlam government, and led to the environment that enabled the dismissal and saw the dislodging of a democratically elected government. I mean, you can draw a line in a way between that and the Murdoch-owned Fox News enablement of the MAGA movement and the Trump presidency, and God help us, perhaps another one. So, you know, we've got a bit to reflect on here in Australia, don't we?
Look, just to be devil's advocate for a minute, I wonder about some of this commentary when you've got people like Anne Connolly and her efforts at the ABC in relation to aged care, which led directly to the Royal Commission, Adele Ferguson, along with Wacker Williams, the National Senator, and their efforts on bank misbehaviour, which led to the Banking Royal Commission, and also, of course, Nick McKenzie, and most recently what he succeeded in, along with other reporters at 9 newspapers and also the 9 network, in relation to the CFMEU, for example, whether that, in fact, are indications that there's better health there than might sometimes seem to be the case.
Jim, those examples, they're great examples, but they're great examples of the system working in spite of itself. These are fantastic journalists who've used enormous skills, but people like Nick McKenzie has paid an enormous price. Nick McKenzie and Chris Masters spent years going through extraordinarily painful and expensive defamation case against Ben Roberts-Smith in exposing the allegations of war crimes by Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan. Now, that should never have happened. So much of one of the problems that we have when it comes to advocating for greater press freedom in Australia is that it's very difficult to quantify the stories not told, right? We just don't know. What we do know from all sorts of anecdotal evidence, from media lawyers, from journalists, and from their sources, is that the chilling effect is real, right? Journalists and their lawyers are making calculated decisions to shut down stories because they know the risks of litigation are too high and the costs of failure, the price of failure, is the closure of their news organisation. We know of sources who have been looking to the stories of David McBride and Richard Boyle and so many of the others that we've been discussing and saying, you know what, I can't afford to go there. Now, those stories that you've just articulated are wonderful examples of courageous journalists and extraordinary whistleblowers, but that is not evidence of the system at work, because everything we've discussed today around the culture of secrecy, that is the problem. We've got some ideas, particularly at the AGF, of how we might start to change those cultures, but to suggest that we're in good shape, I think, is misdirection.
So Chris, are the examples that I suggested, and do they point, as Peter was saying, to journalists operating despite the worst characteristics of the system currently?
Absolutely, there's been a complete, thank you. Absolutely, there's been a complete reversal of the dynamic. Just to, again, give you kind of a historical sense of the shift. If you look back to the Whitlam government, one of your jobs, and even the Hawke government really, one of your jobs as a press sec was to get to know the journalists in the gallery and help them with their stories. Now, of course, there was the usual pressures in both directions, but there was a sense that journalists could engage with government in a constructive way, in a human and direct way for the benefit of the greater good. I know a press sec who was sacked last year for being too close to journalists, and who, when they actually took up their job originally after the change of government, was told by a very, very, very senior politician that their job was to make sure that their minister got no press at all, right? Now that's the kind of psychology, the kind of cultural atmosphere that means journalists' calls never get returned, that FOIs get pressed against, and so it goes. I think probably your efforts, Delia, at AAP and the survival of AAP is in fact a remarkable and mighty thing. You're probably one of the great hopes as a platform that can sustain a culture that's fighting against that.
Definitely do our best, and it's probably worth noting AAP doesn't do investigative reporting, and I think you're right in saying those are the sort of bright sparks that are the examples that Jim gave. I think one thing that really interests me about this topic is the question about what is the health of public debate, and we've got our role to play as journalists, but I think when the government is looking at mis and disinformation, one thing that I'm seeing is their real concern is about the strength of institutions, and certainly when we look at disinformation, and AAP has a fact-checking unit, when we look at disinformation, so purposefully spread misinformation, if you like, the purpose of that is to erode institutions. And I think that for the government, not to give advice where it's not my role to give it, but I think the only antidote to that is transparency. I think that is the sort of radical approach when you have, well, it shouldn't be radical, but when you have mis and disinformation that is really achieving its ends by undermining trust and confidence in institutions, then the way to build that back up, that trust is through transparency, and that creates, the accountability is obviously where the journalists come in, and that leads to better governance. But I think as part of that question about what is the health of our public debate, I don't think we can ignore the question of where are people getting their news, how are they engaging with it. A vast percentage of young people are getting their news from social media, and on social media they're getting their news in a large percentage from, not journalistic sources. So when we're talking about public interest journalism and what is its role, obviously there is an inherent public good to it, I think, but we have to also think about it in the context of the ecosystem it's existing in, because a lot of the assumption is, you report on something, you put it into the light, and then action will happen. But I think we're seeing examples from the US, obviously, where that's not the case, and public interest journalism exists to inform citizens, and that informing part is a real challenge in the current media environment, I think.
Yes, I do sometimes think it's that the role of journalists in chronicling events has become undervalued over time. There was a time in the old Parliament House, not in the new one, where every media organisation had a reporter in both chambers reporting the debates that were going on. It's a long time, and eventually it was only AAP that had a reporter doing that. Now, and the newspapers, as well as the ABC, for example, were full of accounts from those debates. Now, that stopped, and whether that indicates that the debates became less interesting or simply that the media outlets decided that their readers were no longer interested in what was going on in Parliament, I don't know. But it's certainly the very valuable role that AAP currently provides, and not to be underestimated in its value, is actually reporting things as they happen. And most media organisations, in my view, have lost both the appetite and the ability. And it also means that it does have consequences for transparency and accountability, because if you're not reporting what's in plain sight, what hope have you of actually having an opportunity to report what's hidden? It's left to AAP to do that. And just to sort of square the circle there, Delia, how difficult is it for AAP? I mean, AAP effectively had to go raise the begging bowl because News Corp withdrew its support, which goes to something else, which is the concentration of media in Australia. When you've got 60% or plus of the reach, and then you withdraw financial support from AAP, which leaves you with 20 or 30% of what you currently had, it does mean that the only way you're going to survive is by either philanthropy or public funding. But how difficult has it been for AAP with no certainty of funding into the future, relying on annual trips to the budget round to actually have a satisfactory and successful business model?
Yeah, I think seeking funding, at 6-month or yearly increments is not the perfect business model, it's fair to say. But I do think we're a really interesting point, because we became a not-for-profit 3 years ago, and entirely, I guess, the purpose of AAP stays the same, but the dedication to public interest journalism and trying to find, I guess, how we keep AAP afloat in this context is a challenge. But fortunately, I think we focus on being objective and impartial, and we do perform a role that no other media organisation performs, which is, I guess, we are the wholesale newswire, we are democratic infrastructure, we would say. But I think, like so many of the things that have been discussed today, whether that's sort of secrecy, whistleblowing, there's a lot that sits in this realm that people wouldn't notice the impact of. You don't necessarily see it if it's not there. If someone's not sitting and covering an inquiry that isn't of great, clickable public interest, it's still really valuable. It's still very important. It must be covered. And we won't, in the case of AAP, and a lot of news, you won't necessarily feel the impact of it not being there straight away. But over time, as news voices, as we become even more concentrated, those gaps in coverage and information and accountability, then that is the real worry. And once you lose these institutions, these structures, they don't come back, certainly not. well, that is the great concern, really.
Can I
Peter?
just jump? Yeah, I absolutely endorse what Delia just said. There's a fantastic study, actually kind of really troubling study that I saw from the United States. It's called Financing Dies in Darkness. And a couple of academic institutions in the States surveyed went and looked at the costs of running local government in areas where the local newspaper had shut down. In other words, where there are news deserts. And what they found was that the costs of running local government went dramatically up in those communities. And the relationship they found was causal. In other words, by not having journalists sitting in the council chambers, as Delia just described, by just going through the normal routine business of reporting on what those councils do, the decision-making deteriorated, corruption went up, the cost of borrowing went up, and the costs to the community, bizarrely enough, were higher than the cost of running those local newspapers themselves. But the trouble is, it's very difficult to quantify that because, as you said, we just don't see it. We don't see the impact that good journalism has on the way that our government operates. What we tend to see is the $2 or $5 that we pay every time we have to go and buy a local newspaper, and that's where it becomes. That's why it's often so difficult to make these arguments. But we also need to understand the really crucial role that kind of routine journalism actually plays in a very mundane running of government.
Well, I think that sort of brings us to the fundamental question, which is this all the fault of social media? Is this all the fault of the digital giants? And whether it is or not, what are the solutions?
The bottom,
Chris, yeah.
underneath what you've all just been talking about is the destruction of the rivers of gold of advertising revenue that supported grand papers of record that used to do what only AAP does now.
This is a great advertising platform. Yeah, someone's recording this.
I think the radical nature of having a factually based, credible, independent news wire is historically super important now, given disinformation. I mean, you are a crucial cultural infrastructure on which, in fact, new forms of media could be based and develop if people on the progressive side of politics wanted to get organised and do it. You'll probably remember the Whitewater case, where the Clintons were pursued by packs of reporters, and the technique used by the Republican operatives at the time was to target a group of reporters, feed them a bunch of foggy, dodgy things. By the time those journalists had finished writing their 5 or 7 stories and worked out, in fact, it was a non-story, the Republican operatives had established the next lot they were targeting, and it was just this endless churn. You know, there was no Whitewater story in effect. So to have a set of facts established about a story is an extremely radical thing historically, but now exponentially more than ever because of digital technology and because of disinformation and misinformation. You know, it always comes down to money. It's why the ABC was established. It was why the BBC was established. But of course, certain major media outlets have spent as long as they've been in existence trying to destroy those developments. And that's been done through pincer movements of encouraging government to defund them on the one hand, and more recently getting their own people inside the organisations. This is not a healthy development. It's a bit like osteoporosis. You've got to keep checking those bones. So the one bone we definitely know is completely solid and healthy and calcium rich now is AAP. So what could we build?
There's the tagline.
What could we build
Save
on
yourself
that?
from osteoporosis.
Indeed.
Subscribe to AAP.
Political osteoporosis, yes. So no one much is asking themselves, and I think this is a real gap in what's happening, no one much is asking themselves, well, what could we build on that infrastructure of fact? AAP, Delia correctly says, it's not an investigative news organisation. But if you are an investigative journalist, if you are a serious citizen journalist, if you can go somewhere where there's an established basis of fact, that gives you a head start and avoids the Whitewater kind of trap.
But what is the business model that or business models that can be sustainable. If the rivers of gold are no longer there, is it really, are we left with taxpayer funding or philanthropy?
No, I think obviously we're at the moment where we're trying not to lose things that we can't get back. So government funding has a really important role to play, I think, particularly at the moment, and obviously in an ongoing sense with our public broadcasters. But I think that, you know, media used to exist, the model in many ways was, I guess, they had an advertising monopoly on a location, you know, because a lot of news was specific to this state, this town, and in comes the internet, and suddenly every paper is competing against itself. So you lose that monopoly of attention, and the business model kind of fundamentally breaks from there. I think the position that we're in going forward is, you know, I think this idea of people being passive news consumers, we need to challenge it ourselves a bit, and we need to actually think about, like, in capitalism, where you spend your attention and where you spend your money, like, that is what you value. And to think about how you consume news. And it doesn't have to be, you know, Peter paying his $2 or $5 for a paper, which I wish more people would do. But it can also be, you know, what newsletters do you subscribe to? What information are you getting? And how are you thinking about engaging with that information? Because that is powerful. And so I think, you know, the future of news looks quite different. I think it's really worrying that we obviously are in this increasingly polarized environment where people, you know, understandably, you want to have maybe not your views affirmed, but you want to be reading the papers that align with your values, you know. But we also need to value that sort of the shared facts, if you like, so that debate can happen. So I guess the sort of antidote is, what can we do as individuals in the way that we engage with information? Because, like, I think we're all worried about how things are at the moment, and we do have an individual role to play in that, I think. It's not going to save AAP at this point, but it's, you know, it is one thing that we can take away, I think.
So, Peter, do you have any solutions? And but if not solutions, where, for example, do you see your proposed media freedom legislation as fitting into the ecosystem and in ways that would improve it?
So before we come, I'd like to talk about the Media Freedom Act in a moment, but I think there is a problem of making the distinction between journalism and the other content that's out there at the moment. I mean, Delia spoke about people consuming journalism. The problem is that online, everything pretty much looks the same. It's very difficult when you see something on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, to make the distinction between something that's produced by a credible, experienced, authoritative journalist who's producing work in line with a code of conduct, a set of ethics, and the kind of content that's produced by some kind of crazy conspiracy theorist person. Those two stories, to the casual observer who's glancing at things, look pretty much the same. One of the things that we're proposing is, and we think this is important for journalism and for the public and for that problem of mis and disinformation, is a mechanism, is a professional association that journalists set up themselves in the same way that accountants and lawyers and all sorts of other professions have, that admits voluntary members who show that they produce work according to a standard and who are accountable to that standard, and then they would be allowed to have a badge to identify their journalism as meeting a particular professional standard. It has to be voluntary. We can't stop anybody from producing content. And if someone doesn't want to be a part of that system, we can't say that you shouldn't be producing journalism. But we believe that that is a really important way of helping the public make that distinction and keeping upward pressure on ethics and standards, because I think journalists themselves do have a responsibility here to fulfill that public interest, that public service role that actually fundamentally lies at the root of journalism, of the kind of journalism that we've been talking about.
You know, look, one question. We are at that point where I'll be asking for questions from the audience in a moment, but one other point. How do you address the inevitable scare campaign that will emerge should legislation of this be accepted by a party of government, which is that this is government licensing of journalism, and, you know, We've already seen this in relation to the mis and disinformation legislation, nonsensically in my view, but it's there.
So there are a couple of things. First of all, the courts and the government are already making decisions about who is a journalist. And it's in law. There is a definition of journalist in law. The problem is that it's dysfunctional. It does not work. It tends to focus on the who, on professional association. What we're saying is that if the industry establishes a code of conduct and a mechanism for identifying journalism as a process rather than journalist as a person, then it is industry, not government, that's making that distinction. It is industry that is owning it. It is not government. The government cannot seize control of that and use it as a form of licensing. That's really important. And I think, and as I said, the courts are doing this anyway. There have been a number of examples. There was a case recently in Victoria where a lady who was an anti-vaxxer was standing at a rally next to a bunch of other journalists with her phone up, broadcasting that, claiming that she was a journalist. How do the courts make that distinction between her and someone from the ABC doing exactly the same thing? It's very difficult if you're talking about the act of about what someone is doing, performatively. But if we focus on the ethics and standards and accountability to a code of conduct that lies behind it, then it's very easy to make that distinction. And so what we're trying to do is set up a mechanism that more rationally defines journalism in a way that's transparent, that allows the public to identify it and helps create a much healthier ecosystem of news and information that we can all identify and come to have confidence in. We think we think that we can get this through. It's not a particularly partisan proposition. Everybody agrees with the ideas around press freedom. Everybody, right across the parties, there's cross-party support for the principles that we've been advocating. The problem is getting the kind of political momentum that we think that we need to actually get the parties to pull their fingers out of their backsides and act on this.
Yes, do we have some questions? Yes, we do.
A whole bunch of answers here.
I must admit, where are we going? Up the back here, first of all.
Hi everyone. Melissa Code from the Mandarin, just a garden variety press gallery journalist. I asked this question because when I was casting my eyes around the room earlier this morning, I saw a mother of a veteran who died by suicide, whose face I saw often when I was sitting in the final weeks of the Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide. It was shocking to me that as a sort of non-mainstream media, niche media journalist, there were so few other media personnel in the room. And of course, the panel alluded to being in the room making a difference when it comes to the stories you write. Certainly adds a degree of depth to what might otherwise be a superficial statement of fact. My question is about that business model nut that you've been trying to crack, because good journalism, good public interest journalism isn't just a matter of the business making money, it's also a matter of time. And people like me, we're close to burnout. And when I shifted back into media after working for about a year in the public service, I took a $60,000 pay cut. In this economy, that's insane. It's a big ask of people who are intelligent and capable of earning more. And I'm just not sure how our landscape can cater to that sort of dearth of opportunity.
Killer question.
That's a very good question. And it used to be the case up until about 10 years ago that when people came to me and said, how do I get into journalism? I'd say, well, you should do this, this, and this. And now when they come to me and say, how do I get into journalism? My first question was, do you really want to enter this trade, given its current set of circumstances? Because exactly the kinds of points that you're making are there. Why, in circumstances where you can't make a quid, you're stretched for resources, you're being called on to meet, XD deadlines a day, once over lightly, why on earth would you want to do it? And having got past that barrier, then I can give them the encouragement they deserve. But it is seriously the case. But Chris, you had something to say?
This is Melissa Code from the Mandarin. The Mandarin is a small publication that covers the public service intensely, the only one that does it really in any depth. And last time I saw Melissa, she was in an obscure seminar at the University of Canberra on the very important topic of the future of the APS. So, you know, you're a model of how to do it. The thing is, anything to do, the answer to your question is, it's about the public good, right? And for the last 50 years, everything to do with the public, especially the public good, has been defunded, eroded, depopulated.
Sold off.
Exactly. So in a way, to answer your question, the only way to surviving journalism right now, the only way to survive in the academy right now is to think like a gorilla, to pace yourself, to ensure you don't burn out, because, you know, you're kind of the last line standing in the defence of the public interest. That's a terrible thing. Historically, these things ebb and flow. We are moving into a period of protracted, comprehensive crisis on so many fronts. There's no immediate answer to your question. All there is unceasing, continued effort, making sure not to burn out, because then the bad guys win, as we try and shape a better public, a better society. Unfortunately, the bad guys have rage farming and they've monetised it, and by God, you can hear that ka-ching, 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 can't you? On the social democratic side of thinking, no one's managed to monetise sage farming. And I think there's a worry that public interest, public good kind of media is somehow intrinsically boring. And I think it is a challenge to people on the social democratic side of politics or in the centre to work out how to monetise sage farming by making it not boring and actually getting the ears, eyeballs and attention of people who, you know, are not don't want to be part of the rage farming monetised machine anymore. Hang in, Melissa, keep going, but don't burn out.
Better get another question in the middle here somewhere. Thank you.
My name's Jane, and I actually represent people in the academy now, and I'm a former ABC journalist, so I see what you're saying, the fatigue, the burnout, and feeling like people are up against it. But I want to play devil's advocate as well and ask if the media is undermining itself by drifting towards a content model that means there no longer is such a keen focus on public interest journalism. I'm not saying that necessarily it's happening, but I feel I see a shift, and I'm really keen to hear what you guys think about that.
I think, Peter, you've got an interesting anecdote there, which is about what happens with modern newsrooms and AI.
Which one?
Which is that modern journalism is very much click-oriented, and that so. Whereas there were crude measures of success before, there are now mechanical ones.
Yeah, I need to be a little bit careful because as a member of the AJF, we're very much about media freedom, and so I'm going to step outside my AJF hat for a moment and throw an idea out that I think is worth thinking about. One of the problems with the discussion that we've been having is that it focuses on the responsibility of the journalists to figure out how to fit in and monetize the digital environment. We tend to forget that the digital environment is created by tech companies to monetize our attention for the profit of their shareholders who live offshore. And I think we need to be placing the emphasis on re-engineering the system itself so that it supports good journalism, it supports good public debate, it supports good information flows. We can do that. It just takes the political courage to do it. By having the argument around journalists, and forcing journalists to somehow find a way to make money, to make profit, in an environment that fundamentally is not designed for good information in the first place is asking them to tie themselves in knots in ways that I think are never going to work. Now, as I said, this is not an AJF position, this is my own personal view, but I really do think that when we start to have these conversations, to place the responsibility on journalists themselves to solve the problem of business models, we're looking in the wrong place. This mechanism, and I think the discussions around mis and disinformation, I think are part of that, and the discussions around bans on under 16-year-olds for access to social media is a part of a kind of understanding that actually this ecosystem, this digital environment, and the algorithms and mechanisms or its fundamental design isn't working for us, and that we need to change that design. I think that we'll get round to talking about how it influences journalism and public debate at some point fairly soon as well. But that's my, as I said, that's a personal.
I mean, your last point goes to a very fundamental question, which is, and the one that I have is, why should it be that parents should be responsible for their children's access to digital media? Why is it not the responsibility of the digital giants to be responsible for the quality, etc., of their content in just the same way that other publishers are? And I really do think that this whole nonsense about age gates and so on and so forth is really just a diversion from the real issue. But maybe it is also the case that it's another indication that globalisation has simply got away from us, and the ability of the nation state to retain sovereignty, those days are gone. I might just have time for one more question, if we can be brief, and then.
I can manage without the microphone. We've been talking about the supply side, it seems to me, and I'm concerned that we've got a problem on the demand side. I kind of feel like this is a bit.
Let's have them.
Also, I think similar to the debate about Australia's education system, I think we've got a sort of boiling frog phenomenon. We're letting Australia's education system decay because of the monetisation of that industry, and the public is letting the public information, public journalism system decay because it doesn't actually, as Peter's pointed out, doesn't have the capacity to pick what is good and what is bad, what is worthwhile. So it seems to me that part of the answer to the problems you're talking about is to actually stir up stronger demand for improved or restoring journalism in this country. And I think that it's the responsibility of a whole lot of community organisations, consumer organisations, civil society organisations to understand better what's going on and to start to build the demand that we need.
Look, this is not Q&A. I'm not Tony Jones, but I'll take that as a comment. And given the time constraints that we have, I think we'll just wrap it
Delia's
up
got
there.
something to say, Jim.
I'll give you a quick comment back, though. I would say, like, now is the time to start worrying about demand and where we place value, because even as part of your question, there was, the idea of choice, like us being news consumers, if you like, making choices about our news. We are rapidly entering into sort of the next stage of generative AI, where those choices will be made for us, where we will plug in a question and the answer will be given to us, and that information will be divorced from its source, which is the news outlet that it came from. So, we've already got on the platforms, news is being downgraded. Referrals to news sites on the platforms are already sharply in decline. The next stage is a complete sort of divorced from the platform, from the news site itself. So I think that there isn't an answer to that yet, but that the question of demand and value is at the very heart of it, and that's, you know, something that we really need to think about, cultivate, and media literacy is a really big part of that, and something that needs to become a really important part of curriculums and, you know, more broadly, people understanding the media.
Thank you, Delia. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Peter. Time's up. Thank you all.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.